Nairobi is hosting one of the greatest moments in Africa in the next couple of days, and that is the Africa Climate Summit. We're going to be telling you all you need to know about it, why it's happening, who is coming, what's going to be discussed, and everything else that you need to know. Stay tuned for that. My name is Sellah Bogonko, CEO of Jacob's Ladder Africa, and this is Green Jobs Africa. So the Africa Climate Summit is an event that's holding on the 4th to the 6th of September in Nairobi at the KICC. Let me give you a bit of background of why it's happening. There's been many convenings, meetings, global meetings that have been happening over the years on the issue of climate. And for the most part, those meetings have been convened by other people. And every meeting has an agenda. And that agenda is set by whoever sets the meeting. And so for the most part, African nations have gone and participated and contributed, but it's someone else's agenda that they're contributing to. And this is the genius behind the Africa Climate Summit, because for the first time, we actually have our own thing where we're coming together and saying, this is our agenda. These are perspectives on different issues that have to do with climate. And so this particular summit is themed around green growth and climate finance for Africa and the world. And I'll tell you why the theme is brilliant in the sense that it encapsulates everything that has to do with why Africa is playing a critical role or needs to play a critical role, not just in shaping the agenda or the narrative around climate, but in determining the direction for the rest of the world. A little bit of history for those of us who do not know the history around climate conversations, especially at the global table. In 2009, there was a deal that was signed at Copenhagen, and it was basically saying that the developed nations are going to be contributing $100 billion every single year until 2020 to the developing nations to help them decarbonize. Don't worry about all the jargon, we're going to come back to it in the subsequent episodes. So in 2009, as I was saying earlier, there was an agreement that there's going to be funding that will be given to the developing nations, which is called the Global South, which encapsulates Africa and all the other developing countries. And the idea was that it would help them decarbonize, because there's a conversation at the global stage around how do we continue to develop while at the same time decarbonizing, because we do need funds for us to be able to decarbonize. So that conversation went on, and looking back, tracking around how has that funding been happening? In short, not much of it has been given, or not much of the pledges have been honored throughout that period. And so for the most part, like in many other global conversations, Africa has been waiting for the developed nations that made the promises to honor their promises, but that's not been forthcoming. And then fast forward to last year at COP27, there was a signing of a huge conversation, something that many nations have been pushing for, which is something called the Loss and Damage Fund. And we'll talk about that in a subsequent episode. Don't worry about that. That was a big milestone, because for the first time, there was a conversation around money that will be given for purposes of developing nations being able to use that money to develop, because the other developed nations that have already, used fossil fuels, which is basically extracting oil, and then being able to industrialize using that, which leads to carbonization, has affected the rest of the world. Now, this is the thing about carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. There's a lot of that happening, and it's for the most part attributed to many things, most of them being human activities. But the larger part of it, which is 73%, is attributed to fossil fuels, which is your oils and coal, which is considered to be dirty because it results to a lot of carbonization or releasing of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, which then has an effect on the environment. Now, the Loss and Damage Fund is supposed to help developing nations because they are also being affected by this carbonization or by this emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But this is where the trick comes in, and I'm still getting to the Africa Climate Summit, don't worry about that. The global conversation around climate finance is $1.5 trillion. But the conversation around loss and damage is $100 billion. So if you compare the two, we're basically being told, go to the corner, play around with this $100 billion. And for the most part, like I said, it's not being honored, which means that we're really not making progress as a globe. But this is what many of the developing countries or the global south are focused on, the loss and damage. So the essence of the Africa Climate Summit is primarily focused on, can we change this conversation? And rather than waiting for someone else to set that as an agenda at the global stage, the African nations are coming together to say we need to be able to direct this conversation to a more holistic approach as opposed to being narrowed to a small area, the Loss and Damage Fund. So the Africa Climate Summit is being co-hosted by His Excellency, the President of Kenya, William Samoei Ruto, in partnership with the Africa Union. And this is an African conversation, and it's being convened in Nairobi, Kenya, like I said, from the 4th to the 6th of September. The reason why he's co-hosting is because as the chair of something called CAHOS, which is the chair of heads of state on climate change, at the African Union level, as the chair, he's mandated to sort of like provide the direction for Africa. And I think he's doing a brilliant job at that. And so this summit is Africa taking the leadership position, finally saying we will come to the global stage, but we will come with our agenda. But for us to be able to go with our agenda, we are 55 nations. We have to be able to sit around a table and then agree on what are those areas that we need to address. For example, Ghana just discovered oil. And they're thinking other countries have developed on oil and we've just discovered vast amounts of oil. This is an opportunity for our country to develop. And convincing Ghana to let go of oil and have a conversation around renewable energy is great, but it needs to be done in a very systematic way that enables them to see the value and why they need to do it and all that. So those are some of the conversations that are going to be holding. So you have conversations around renewable energy, and rather than, of course, like in Kenya, we are 92% green in our grid, so we are on the side of the renewable energy, but there are countries that have discovered oil, like I've said. So how do you bring those minds together and yet we're on the same continent? When it comes to, say, a country like South Africa, it's large on coal. Most of its energy comes from coal and all that. But how do you convince them to begin to think about renewable energy? And so you'll begin to hear terms like just energy transition, which means you guys have developed using fossil fuels. We are just discovering fossil fuels, and it's a lot of it on the continent. How do we begin to move towards a decarbonized world, but at the same time not slowing down the development of the African countries? There's a lot to discuss, and that's why this summit is timely. It is relevant. It's needful for all of us in Africa, not just to participate. And if you're not able to participate physically in the meeting, you do need to lend your voice in one way or the other, whether it's in your country or in your organization. You do need to lend your voice, young and old. As Africans, we need to come together and say, this is what we believe in, this is what is required for us to be able to make progress. So the Africa Climate Summit is an amazing opportunity for many African countries, like I said, to come together. And it's not just going to be about political, leadership conversations. There are business meetings that are going to be held. And in fact, there's something called the deal room, where there's going to be announceables, which is something that is exciting me about the summit, that it's not just going to be about talking, it's about action. One of the outputs of the summit is going to be announceables, like what is it that we actually want as a nation, as a continent, but what are some of the deals in terms of investments that are being not promised to the continent, but are being signed during this summit, or have already been signed and are being announced at this summit. So it's going to be action oriented and not just conversations, which is exciting for me. And so there are going to be many side events, which is great because there are going to be different conversations going on, whether it's on climate smart agriculture, renewable energy. As Jacob's Ladder, we have an event on green livelihoods, which is our focus area in terms of, while all these conversations are going on, how do we create jobs for young people? How do we make sure that they're not just being told the outcome of the summit, but they're participating and that they are relevant in terms of the decisions that are being made? So that's just a little bit about what you need to know about the summit, but there is so much more, and we will endeavor to keep you posted, not just now, but during the summit as well. So please stick around for that. Thank you so much for watching. And should you have any questions, comments, contributions, should you even have information about the summit, you're probably hosting an event or participating in one way or the other, feel free to engage with us on our social media handles, which are right below. You can write us an email as well, share your experiences during and after the summit. My name is Sellah Bogonko. I'm the CEO of Jacob's Ladder Africa, and this is Green Jobs Africa.